In the small town of Pulaski, Tennessee, on a cold December evening in 1865, a group of 6 former Confederate officers gathered in secret. Their initial idea was simple enough: to form a brotherhood, a fraternal club where they could share camaraderie, stories of the war, and a sense of belonging in a world that had been turned upside down. The Civil War had ended, the Confederacy was gone, and the South was in ruins, economically, socially, and politically. These men, stripped of their former power and place in society, sought to create something that gave them meaning, a ritualistic society with ranks, symbols, and ceremonies. On the surface, it may have looked harmless, almost like any other fraternal order of the time. But underneath the cloak of ritual and secrecy, something darker began to grow. What started as a club quickly became a vessel for discontent, resentment, and fear. These men were not just seeking companionship, they were clinging to a vision of the Old South that no longer existed. They gave themselves titles that sounded medieval and grand: imperial wizards, grand dragons, cyclops, as though by inventing an elaborate hierarchy, they could restore the power they had lost. The rituals and strange costumes were not only for amusement, they were meant to intimidate. They wanted to cast themselves as figures of mystery and strength, shadows in the night that could control communities through fear. As Reconstruction unfolded, with formerly enslaved people beginning to exercise their rights, these secret gatherings became more than social meetings. They turned into organized attempts to resist change. In Pulaski and soon in towns and counties across the South, the Brotherhood expanded. Their secrecy allowed them to operate with a freedom that ordinary political groups could not. Behind closed doors, they whispered about restoring the old order, and when they emerged, their actions left communities shaken. It's important to recognize how quickly a simple idea can transform into something with far-reaching consequences. A gathering that started with a few men talking around a fire would, in time, evolve into one of the most infamous organizations in American history. The robes, the symbols, the night rides, all of it was designed to project power where none truly existed. And yet, through fear and intimidation, they reshaped the course of history in the South for generations to come. The story of the Klan's origins is not only about the men who formed it, but also about the society that allowed it to flourish. It shows how myths, fear, and nostalgia for a lost world can be turned into tools of influence. Understanding these beginnings is essential if we are to fully grasp the legacy that followed. If you find this kind of hidden history important, stories that are often overlooked or simplified, I invite you to join us on this journey. There is so much more to uncover, so much more to learn about the ways history continues to echo in our world today. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter in our exploration of forgotten history. Together, we can keep these lessons alive, not as glorification, but as understanding. In the years that followed the end of the Civil War, the South was a place of uncertainty. Entire towns were scarred by the conflict, and the old order had been broken apart. In the middle of this uneasy landscape, an unusual society began to emerge, one that cloaked itself in secrecy, mystery, and ritual. To understand its influence, we have to look at how it was structured, because the way it organized itself was unlike anything America had seen before. From the very beginning, its leaders knew that symbols of authority mattered. They wanted more than a gathering of men, they wanted an institution that would command loyalty and fear. So, they created a hierarchy filled with elaborate titles that sounded grand and almost mythical. At the very top was the Imperial Wizard, a name chosen to inspire awe, a figure who would be seen not just as an organizer, but as a kind of supreme authority, almost untouchable. Beneath him were the Grand Dragons, each responsible for overseeing entire states, which they called realms. From there the structure filtered downward: deputies, local leaders, and ordinary followers. Each layer was given its own fantastical name, and each role came with responsibilities, rituals, and expectations. This was no accident. The men who designed the system understood human nature well enough to know that people are drawn to ceremony and rank. By dressing up their organization with strange titles and rituals, they gave members a sense of importance and belonging. The secret meetings, coded language, and mysterious costumes made ordinary men feel like part of something larger than themselves. For those who had lost everything after the war, their property, their political power, their sense of identity, this new order promised purpose. It offered them a ladder they could climb, titles they could claim, and the illusion of prestige in a time when their world had been reduced to rubble. It was within this strange hierarchy that one name stood out, Nathan Bedford Forrest. A man who had once been a Confederate general, Forrest was known for his military skill, his charisma, and his commanding presence. He was chosen as the first national leader, the Imperial Wizard. His reputation alone gave the group credibility. To many in the South, Forrest was already a figure of legend, an officer who had risen from humble beginnings to become one of the most feared cavalry commanders of the war. In choosing him, the organization secured not only a leader but a symbol, someone whose name could rally support and give the group an aura of legitimacy. But what's most striking is not just the creation of a chain of command. It's the way this system mirrored the very power structures that had dominated the South before the war. On plantations, in politics, and in the military, hierarchy was the language of authority. By reinventing it under different names, the organization was, in essence, recreating a version of the old world in secret. It was a way of holding on to the past, even as the rest of the nation moved forward. The rituals that accompanied this structure were equally elaborate. Ceremonies of initiation were filled with strange oaths, symbolic gestures, and dramatic performances meant to impress and unsettle newcomers. These acts weren't random. They were carefully crafted to build loyalty and to instill the idea that joining was not simply a choice but a transformation. Members were no longer just individuals, they became part of a hidden order with its own rules, its own leaders, and its own vision for society. As the ranks expanded, so did the influence of the hierarchy. Orders flowed downward, and loyalty flowed upward. This structure allowed the group to spread quickly while maintaining a sense of coordination, even though there was no official roster or central record. The secrecy of the system made it difficult for outsiders to understand just how far the influence reached. Some communities whispered of its presence but had no proof, while others saw firsthand how it operated in the shadows. What makes this story compelling is not only the details of the titles or the name of its leader, but the deeper meaning behind them. Human beings have always been drawn to systems that give them structure, status, and purpose. In times of loss and confusion, those needs become even stronger. The elaborate hierarchy created by this organization tapped into that desire, offering ordinary men a chance to feel extraordinary. It was a clever psychological strategy that helped turn a small gathering into a movement with reach far beyond what anyone could have imagined in those first secret meetings. Nathan Bedford Forrest's role in all of this was both practical and symbolic. He did not invent the rituals or titles, but his presence at the top gave the group a face that carried weight. For followers, he was proof that they were part of something serious, something that mattered. For outsiders, his leadership was a sign that this was not just a pastime, it was an organized force. In many ways, Forrest's appointment cemented the group's identity and ensured its survival beyond its earliest days. Looking back, it is clear that this hierarchy was more than theatrics. It was a blueprint for influence, designed to appeal to pride, fear, and loyalty. It helped transform a handful of disillusioned men into a network that stretched across states, one that left an imprint on history that is still studied today. The titles may sound strange, even theatrical, to modern ears, but in their time, they carried weight. They gave ordinary men the illusion of nobility, the sense of fighting for a cause larger than themselves. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson hidden in this part of history, the power of symbols, structure, and leadership to transform discontent into a movement. Titles and rituals may seem like small things, but when woven into the fabric of a broken society, they can become tools that reshape the world around them. In the years immediately following the Civil War, the South was a land of fragile hope. Reconstruction promised change, new rights, new opportunities, and the possibility of building a society no longer bound to the old ways. Freed men and women walked into courthouses to register their names, stood in line to cast ballots, and even won seats in local and state governments. For a brief moment, it seemed as if a new chapter in American history was being written. But alongside this hope grew a shadow determined to snuff it out. Across towns and counties, a secret network began to operate at night. They gathered quietly, their meetings hidden, their plans whispered in secrecy. Their mission was simple but devastating: to make sure that progress would not last. They did not challenge the new order with open debate or political discourse. Instead, they turned to fear. In the dead of night, groups would appear at the homes of citizens who had dared to register to vote or who had spoken too loudly about change. The knock at the door was not a request, it was a warning. Lanterns flickered in the darkness, voices demanded silence, and the message was clear: participation in this new democracy came with a price. Churches and schools, once symbols of freedom and progress, also became targets. These were the places where communities gathered to learn, to worship, and to strengthen the bonds of their newfound liberty. By striking at them, the secret organization sought to unravel the very fabric of community life. Every torch carried into the night, every door kicked in, every building set aflame was part of a larger campaign to remind freed citizens that their rights were fragile and could be taken away. Voter suppression became one of their sharpest tools. On election days, intimidation was often enough to keep people away from the polls. Men who had stood proudly to cast their first ballot now thought twice, not because they lacked courage, but because they knew their families might pay the price. The ballot box was supposed to symbolize freedom; instead, it became a place of fear. Through threats and violence, this secret force managed to twist democracy into an illusion, where only certain voices could be safely heard. Behind the brutality was a strategy. By silencing individuals, they hoped to silence entire communities. If a teacher was threatened, students might not return to school. If a preacher was attacked, congregations might scatter. If a farmer was beaten, his neighbors would hesitate to stand with him. Fear spread quickly, and in that fear, the group found power. The effect was not only physical but also psychological. Imagine living in a world where any step forward could bring danger to your doorstep. Imagine weighing every decision, whether to vote, whether to speak, whether to gather with neighbors, against the possibility of reprisal. This invisible weight pressed down on communities, draining them of the confidence needed to move forward. Meanwhile, the wider South began to feel the ripple effects. Legislators and leaders sympathetic to the cause of Reconstruction found themselves undermined. Elections tilted toward candidates who promised a return to the old order. The progress that had once seemed possible began to stall, replaced by policies that restricted rather than expanded freedom. Slowly but surely, the vision of a different future for the South dimmed. And yet, it is important to see that this was not just random violence. It was calculated. It was part of a broader effort to restore a system of control that had been shattered by the war. Through fear, they rebuilt a hierarchy that the battlefield had destroyed. They could not undo emancipation, but they could weaken its impact. They could not openly dismantle Reconstruction laws, but they could make them nearly impossible to enforce. The story of these years is not only one of cruelty but also of resistance. For every act of intimidation, there were men and women who still found the courage to stand in line on election day, to teach in schools, to preach in churches, and to gather in defiance of fear. Their persistence, even in the face of overwhelming danger, remains a testament to resilience. Still, the scars left behind were deep. Communities were reshaped not only by what they endured but also by what they lost: voices silenced, opportunities erased, futures stolen. The legacy of these years would stretch far beyond the generation that lived through them, casting a shadow over the South for decades to come. This part of history reminds us of the fragility of progress. Rights, once won, are not guaranteed. They can be challenged, eroded, and undermined, not always in the open, but often in the shadows, through fear and intimidation. It shows how quickly hope can be met with resistance, and how courage must constantly rise to meet it. The campaign that unfolded during Reconstruction was not just about individuals, it was about shaping the future of an entire region. By targeting voters, leaders, and communities, this hidden network managed to bend history to its will, at least for a time. And the echoes of that struggle remind us today that the fight for equality is never simple, never easy, and never truly finished. By the dawn of the 1870s, the South was no longer the same fractured landscape it had been in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Years of shadowy violence and organized intimidation had shaken communities, but the federal government had begun to take notice. Washington could no longer ignore the reports pouring in from southern towns, ballots stolen through fear, officials threatened in the dead of night, families scattered by attacks meant to silence their voices. The dream of Reconstruction was under siege, and if it was to survive, decisive action had to be taken. The response came in the form of laws and policies that struck at the very heart of the secret organizations. Congress passed a series of measures known as the Enforcement Acts. These were not ordinary pieces of legislation, they were direct answers to the campaign of intimidation that had spread across the South. For the first time, federal authority could be used to protect citizens at the polls, to prosecute those who conspired to strip away rights, and to push back against the climate of fear. What made these laws particularly powerful was their scope. Local authorities had often turned a blind eye, or, in some cases, quietly sympathized with the men who met under hoods and shadows. The Enforcement Acts bypassed that problem by allowing federal marshals and even troops to step in where local justice had failed. Suddenly, those who had once moved freely in the night found themselves facing something they had not expected: accountability on a national scale. President Ulysses S. Grant, himself a former general who had seen the worst of war, took these measures seriously. He understood that the battle for the nation's future was not just fought on the battlefield but in town halls, schools, and voting stations. In certain regions, he went so far as to suspend habeas corpus, a drastic step that allowed federal forces to arrest suspects and hold them without the usual delays of local courts. It was a sign of how grave the situation had become, and how determined the government was to bring stability. For those who had once thrived on secrecy, this new reality was jarring. Federal troops patrolled roads that had once been safe passage for their midnight rides. Courtrooms echoed with the testimony of witnesses who had been emboldened by the presence of federal law. Some members were arrested, others fled, and still more simply melted back into ordinary life, unwilling to risk exposure. By the mid-1870s, the once cohesive network that had spread terror across the South began to unravel. But dismantling a large, organized movement did not mean erasing the mindset behind it. While the original group weakened under the pressure of federal crackdowns, the spirit of resistance to Reconstruction did not disappear. Instead, it fragmented. Independent vigilante bands, smaller and less structured, continued to operate in pockets of the South. They no longer carried the same national name or hierarchy, but their goals remained aligned: to resist change, to restore old hierarchies, and to make sure progress came at a cost. These local groups were harder to track. Without a central leadership, they were unpredictable, springing up in one county, then vanishing and reappearing in another. They often blended into communities, operating less like an army and more like loose factions tied together by shared resentment. For families trying to live in peace, this meant that the danger had not truly passed. The threat was no longer a single, unified shadow, it was many smaller ones, scattered but still dangerous. At the same time, the federal government faced its own limits. Troops could not be stationed everywhere. Courts could only try so many cases. And as the years went by, political will in the North began to wane. Reconstruction was expensive, unpopular in certain circles, and difficult to sustain. Though the Enforcement Acts had succeeded in weakening the most visible aspects of the secret organizations, they could not erase the undercurrents of hostility running through the South. This moment in history serves as a powerful reminder of the struggle between progress and resistance. On one side stood laws meant to guarantee equality, backed by federal power. On the other side were those who refused to let go of a world that no longer existed. For a brief time, it seemed as though the law had triumphed, and in many ways, it had. Elections were safer, citizens were more secure, and communities could breathe without constant fear. Yet the persistence of smaller factions showed that the conflict was far from over. The early 1870s marked both a victory and a warning. A victory, because federal resolve had shown that justice could be defended when courage was matched with action. A warning, because it proved that dismantling an organization did not mean dismantling an idea. The remnants of resistance would adapt, evolve, and re-emerge in different forms throughout the decades that followed. Looking back, the federal crackdowns stand as one of the most determined efforts to protect democracy during a fragile time. They demonstrate how law, when enforced with conviction, can bend the arc of history. But they also reveal the limits of power, and how deeply rooted divisions can outlast even the strongest measures. The story of this chapter is not just about the weakening of a notorious group, it is about the resilience of communities that, even under threat, refuse to surrender their voice. It is about the ongoing clash between progress and resistance, a clash that would shape the South, and the nation, long after the 1870s had passed. In the early years of the 20th century, decades after the first wave of secret societies had seemed to fade into obscurity, America was undergoing profound change. Cities were growing at a rapid pace, immigrants were arriving in numbers never seen before, and industries were reshaping daily life. For many, this was an age of progress, of opportunity, of new beginnings. But for others, these transformations stirred feelings of fear, uncertainty, and a longing for a past that seemed more familiar. Out of that atmosphere of tension, a revival was waiting to be born. The spark came in 1915, not in a dusty southern courthouse or a quiet country town, but on the silver screen. That year, a motion picture premiered that captured the imagination of audiences across the nation. It was more than just a film, it was a cultural event. Its grand storytelling, its sweeping battle scenes, and its use of new cinematic techniques made it one of the most talked-about productions of its time. But alongside its technical brilliance was something more troubling. It presented a distorted vision of history, a narrative that glorified shadowy figures and framed them as saviors in a time of turmoil. For William J. Simmons, a former preacher and fraternal organizer, the film was not merely entertainment, it was inspiration. To him, the story on the screen was a call to action, a chance to resurrect something that had once gripped the South and transform it into a movement for a new era. He envisioned not a small brotherhood hidden in secrecy, but a mass organization that could spread across the nation. And so, on a hilltop in Georgia, with a burning cross casting light into the night sky, Simmons inaugurated what would become the second wave of this movement. Unlike its earlier incarnation, this new revival did not rely solely on whispers and shadows. It was organized, visible, and bold in its reach. Simmons drew from his experience with fraternal orders, shaping the group with rituals, titles, and ceremonies that appealed to a wide audience. He understood that people were drawn to pageantry, to belonging, to the idea of being part of something larger than themselves. Membership was marketed almost like a club, complete with parades, uniforms, and elaborate symbolism. What had once been confined largely to the South now spread into cities and towns across the Midwest, the West, and even the North. The timing was crucial. America was wrestling with waves of immigration, debates over cultural identity, and the anxieties of rapid modernization. Simmons and his organizers tapped into those fears, presenting their group as protectors of tradition and defenders of a way of life they claimed was under threat. Recruitment soared, and by the 1920s, membership numbers reached into the millions. For the first time, this was not a small circle of men meeting behind closed doors, it was a national force, present in statehouses, school boards, and police departments. What made this revival so striking was its ability to adapt to its audience. In the South, it still drew on old themes, but in other regions, it shifted its message. In cities filled with new immigrant populations, it spoke about preserving American values. In small towns, it positioned itself as a guardian of morality and order. Its rhetoric was flexible enough to appeal to a wide swath of society, from working-class laborers to middle-class professionals. Families joined, women formed auxiliaries, and children marched in parades. It was no longer just a men's club, it became a cultural presence woven into public life. This expansion gave the organization unprecedented influence. Politicians courted its support, newspapers covered its events, and local communities found themselves divided between those who joined and those who opposed. The group's sheer size made it a formidable presence in the national conversation. Yet behind the ceremonies and slogans, its core mission remained tied to resistance against the changing face of America. For those who lived through this period, the spectacle was impossible to ignore. Parades filled with robed figures marched down main streets. Banners hung from buildings. Membership cards and symbols became common in homes. Unlike the shadows of the 1860s, this was a movement that had stepped boldly into daylight. It fed on the anxieties of the moment and grew stronger because of them. And yet, its very visibility also planted the seeds of its eventual decline. The more it stepped into public life, the more scrutiny it attracted. Scandals involving leaders, exposure of corruption, and growing opposition from outside groups began to erode the polished image Simmons had worked to create. But for a time, its influence was undeniable, shaping conversations at dinner tables, in town halls, and in the halls of government. The revival of the 1910s and 1920s was not simply the rebirth of an old organization, it was a reinvention. It showed how a movement, once nearly extinguished, could adapt to new fears and new audiences, and in doing so, gain a reach it had never known before. The millions who joined did so not in secret basements, but in public rallies, convinced they were part of something patriotic and righteous. History, however, has a way of revealing the deeper truths beneath such facades. The second wave of this movement serves as a powerful reminder of how stories, symbols, and shared anxieties can be transformed into massive social forces. It began with a film, a flickering image projected onto a screen, and grew into one of the largest organized movements of its time. Its legacy reminds us of the power of narrative, how the stories we tell, and the fears we amplify, can shape not only individual lives but the course of an entire nation. The 1920s were an era of contradictions in the United States. On one hand, the country was experiencing dazzling prosperity, jazz clubs filled the night air with music, automobiles rolled off assembly lines in staggering numbers, and cities glowed with the bright lights of a new age. Yet beneath that surface of excitement and modernity, there was unease. Old traditions felt as though they were slipping away, challenged by immigration, cultural change, and shifting social values. It was in this atmosphere of tension that the revived organization of the time found its moment to step fully into the national stage. No longer a fringe movement hidden in secrecy, it now presented itself as a guardian of American morality. Its leaders spoke with confidence about defending the nation against perceived threats, claiming to stand for law, order, and purity. The Prohibition era gave them a cause to rally around. With the banning of alcohol, they portrayed themselves as enforcers of moral discipline, marching through towns and staging rallies that called for a sober and orderly society. For many who felt that modern life was spinning out of control, this message carried real weight. But their influence stretched far beyond alcohol. They embraced segregation as a central part of their vision for the country, insisting that communities must remain divided along lines of race. At the same time, their message widened to include hostility toward immigrants, particularly those arriving from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Poles, and other newcomers were painted as outsiders, bringing with them cultures and traditions that, in the eyes of this group, threatened the fabric of the nation. Religious difference also became a target. Catholics, with their allegiance to the Pope, and Jewish communities, with their growing presence in American cities, were framed as incompatible with the true America the organization claimed to defend. What made this period remarkable was not simply the breadth of these ideas, but the political power that came with them. The movement of the 1920s was not content to remain on the sidelines, it sought direct influence over laws and leaders. Its members ran for office and won, not just in the South but across the Midwest and West as well. State legislatures, school boards, and even governorships saw candidates tied to the organization taking seats of authority. Entire towns would find themselves under its sway, with parades filling the streets and rallies drawing crowds by the thousands. The reach was extraordinary, and for a moment, it seemed as if this was not just a cultural movement but a political one with the ability to shape the course of the nation. For ordinary families, joining could feel like a statement of belonging. Members were promised a sense of community and a chance to participate in public rituals that made them feel part of something larger. They attended picnics, parades, and festivals. They carried banners and wore uniforms with pride. And as their numbers swelled into the millions, the organization became a household presence. Newspapers covered its activities, businesses displayed their support, and politicians sought its endorsement. In a decade of uncertainty, it provided structure, identity, and what seemed to many like moral clarity. But behind the parades and proclamations, cracks were forming. The very size of the organization made it vulnerable to internal conflicts. Leaders at different levels argued over strategy, money, and influence. Local factions clashed, each eager to exert control over the movement's future. And as scrutiny increased, scandals began to emerge. Some of its most prominent figures were exposed for corruption, misuse of funds, and personal misconduct. The image of purity and discipline they worked so hard to present crumbled under the weight of these revelations. Public opinion shifted quickly. Newspapers that once reported on their parades with admiration began exposing their inner turmoil. Political allies distanced themselves. Membership numbers, which had once soared, started to collapse. For all its power, the movement had overreached, and the scandals at its core revealed that it was not the unshakable moral force it had claimed to be. By the end of the decade, the dazzling rise of the 1920s had given way to decline. The group that once filled stadiums and claimed millions of members was fractured, weakened by infighting and discredited by its own leaders' failings. Though smaller factions would continue in various forms, the height of its national influence had passed. The story of this era is striking not only for the sheer scale of its reach but also for the speed with which it crumbled. It shows how fear and uncertainty can fuel mass movements, drawing in ordinary people with promises of protection and identity. But it also reveals how corruption, division, and the truth of human weakness can bring even the most powerful organizations to their knees. The 1920s were remembered as the Jazz Age, a decade of glamour, excitement, and change. But woven into that tapestry was this parallel story, one of rallies, parades, and political ambition, followed swiftly by scandal and collapse. It serves as a reminder that history is rarely as simple as the headlines suggest. Movements that rise quickly on waves of fear and promise often carry within them the seeds of their own undoing. And when they fall, they leave behind lessons about power, identity, and the consequences of building influence on division and mistrust. The middle of the 20th century was a period of remarkable transformation in the United States. The civil rights movement was gaining strength, as ordinary citizens demanded equal access to schools, buses, workplaces, and the ballot box. Leaders spoke with courage, inspiring marches, sit-ins, and boycotts that captured the world's attention. But as this call for justice grew louder, there were those determined to resist it, and among them were local groups that had carried forward the traditions of an earlier era. These groups did not operate as a single powerful organization, as they once had in decades past. Instead, they re-emerged in scattered towns and counties, each chapter clinging to old symbols while focusing their energy on one thing: stopping the progress of civil rights. Their resistance was not limited to speeches or rallies. They turned to intimidation, hoping to silence voices that called for equality. In the Deep South, the courage of those fighting for change was met with acts of brutality that shocked the conscience of the nation. Civil rights workers who registered voters faced constant threats. Families who dared to challenge segregation often found themselves targeted. The violence was not random but calculated, designed to send a chilling message, that those who sought change would pay a heavy price. One of the most heartbreaking examples came in Mississippi, where Medgar Evers, a veteran and prominent activist, was assassinated in 1963. His tireless efforts to dismantle segregation made him a symbol of hope for many, but also a target for those desperate to preserve the old order. His death left a deep scar, yet it also galvanized the movement, as his sacrifice reminded the country of what was at stake. Another tragedy unfolded in Birmingham, Alabama, a city that had already become a flashpoint in the struggle for civil rights. In 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church, a safe haven and meeting place for activists, was bombed on a Sunday morning. Four young girls, full of promise and innocence, lost their lives in the explosion. The attack horrified the world. For many Americans watching the movement unfold on television, it was a moment of reckoning, proof that the struggle for freedom was being met with deadly resistance. These acts of violence were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader campaign to halt integration and maintain a system of inequality. Local chapters organized night rides, cross burnings, and coordinated attacks on activists and their allies. The intention was always the same: to create fear, to make those pushing for change feel that they were alone, vulnerable, and powerless. Yet, rather than crushing the civil rights movement, this campaign of terror often had the opposite effect. Each act of violence drew greater national attention to the injustices of segregation. Television networks broadcast images of marches met with brutality, churches in ruins, and grieving families who refused to be silenced. The more the resistance sought to intimidate, the more the broader American public began to recognize the moral urgency of the movement. The federal government, pressured by public outrage, began to take stronger action. New laws were passed, aimed at protecting the right to vote and ending segregation in public spaces. While the struggle was far from over, progress could no longer be stopped by the tactics of fear. For the activists who continued their work, each tragedy became another reason to press forward, to honor those who had given their lives by ensuring that their vision of equality would not die with them. The local chapters that carried out these attacks believed they could halt history, that through intimidation they could hold back the tide of change. But the movement they opposed was far stronger than they realized. The voices of young students, church leaders, mothers, and fathers filled the streets, refusing to be silenced. Even in the face of violence, communities rallied together, determined to build a future that looked different from the past. Looking back, the re-emergence of these groups during the civil rights era serves as both a grim reminder and a powerful lesson. It reveals how deeply some will cling to old systems of power, even to the point of violence. But it also shows how courage, unity, and determination can overcome the darkest of challenges. The sacrifices of those years carved a path forward, proving that even in the face of intimidation, justice has a way of breaking through. The civil rights movement was not simply a struggle for laws or policies, it was a struggle for the soul of the nation. And while local groups attempted to derail it with threats and terror, their actions only highlighted the necessity of change. Out of tragedy came resolve, and from the ashes of violence arose a vision of a better, more equal America. By the late 20th century, the influence of groups that had once loomed large in American life was beginning to wane. But their decline was not simply the result of fading interest or the passage of time, it was also the product of determined individuals and courageous families who chose to fight back, not only in the streets but also in the courts. One of the most powerful examples of this came in the 1980s, when a case in Alabama would set a precedent that struck at the financial core of these organizations. The story begins with tragedy. In Mobile, Alabama, a young man named Michael Donald was walking home one night in 1981 when he was brutally attacked and killed by men connected to a local chapter. The crime was shocking, not only for its violence but also for the way it seemed to harken back to an earlier era of terror. For many in the community, it was a grim reminder that although the nation had moved forward in many ways, there were still those who clung to old hatreds. Michael's mother, Beulah Mae Donald, was devastated by the loss of her son. But her grief soon transformed into something larger, a determination to see justice done. She wanted accountability, not only for the individuals who had committed the act, but also for the group whose rhetoric and influence had made it possible. Her resolve would take her beyond the criminal courts, into a realm where civil law could be used as a weapon against hate. Working with lawyers from the Southern Poverty Law Center, Beulah Mae Donald filed a lawsuit that directly targeted the organization itself. The argument was simple but groundbreaking: if a group's members carried out acts of violence, and those acts were tied to the group's influence or leadership, then the organization could be held financially responsible. This was not just about punishing individuals, it was about dismantling the infrastructure that allowed such violence to flourish. The case captured national attention as it made its way through the courts. For many Americans, it was a moment of reckoning, a chance to see whether the legal system could hold extremist groups accountable in a way that criminal prosecutions often could not. Inside the courtroom, jurors heard evidence about how hate was spread, how leaders encouraged acts of intimidation, and how these messages fueled real-world violence. When the verdict finally came in 1987, it was historic. The jury awarded the Donald family a staggering sum in damages, millions of dollars. For the local group involved, the financial blow was devastating. Their property was seized, their assets sold, and their ability to function effectively destroyed. The case sent a clear message: organizations that promoted or enabled violence could be held accountable not just morally, but financially. This outcome was more than just a personal victory for the Donald family. It represented a turning point in the fight against extremism in America. By striking at the financial heart of these groups, activists and lawyers found a new way to limit their influence. Without money to organize, recruit, or spread propaganda, many local chapters crumbled. The ruling encouraged similar lawsuits in other parts of the country, each one further eroding the foundation on which these groups had stood for so long. The bravery of Beulah May Donald cannot be overstated. At a time when challenging such organizations was not only difficult but dangerous, she stood firm. Her fight turned personal tragedy into a landmark legal precedent, showing that justice could be achieved in ways that went beyond traditional trials. Her persistence ensured that her son's death would not be forgotten, and that it would serve as a catalyst for real change. By the end of the 1980s, the impact of cases like this was clear. Membership in these groups was shrinking, their visibility diminished, and their ability to operate openly greatly reduced. Scandals, leadership disputes, and cultural shifts further contributed to their decline, but the courtroom victories played a crucial role in weakening their hold. The legacy of these lawsuits endures as a reminder that even entrenched hate can be confronted, not only through protest and activism, but also through the steady power of the law. The lawsuit over Michael Donald's death remains one of the most significant blows against organized extremism in modern American history. It demonstrated that accountability could reach beyond individuals, striking at entire networks and dismantling them piece by piece. For those who believed such groups were untouchable, the case proved otherwise. Out of an act of senseless violence came a victory that reshaped the landscape of civil rights in the United States. It is a story of resilience, courage, and the enduring pursuit of justice, a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, determined individuals can change the course of history. In the middle of the 20th century, America was undergoing enormous change. The nation had fought through the Great Depression, entered World War II, and was preparing for the turbulent decades ahead. Yet beneath the surface of progress and unity, there were shadows that revealed just how deeply old divisions were still woven into parts of American society. One of those shadows appeared in the world of politics, where some figures who would later become nationally recognized leaders began their careers with affiliations that, today, seem shocking. One of the most notable cases was that of Robert Byrd, a young man from West Virginia in the 1940s. Byrd came from modest beginnings, working-class roots in the Appalachian Hills where opportunity was scarce and traditions often ran deep. In communities like his, certain organizations that are now universally condemned were, at the time, more visible, more normalized, and in some cases, even seen as a stepping stone into politics. For Byrd, joining such a group was not only about belonging but also about gaining influence in a world where connections mattered as much as ideas. The story of Byrd in those years is not one of violence or high-profile acts, but rather of ambition, insecurity, and the search for identity in a rapidly changing America. In the 1940s, he was still finding his voice, eager to rise above his humble beginnings. In those circles, speeches were made, meetings were held, and young men were encouraged to see themselves as part of a cause larger than their own lives. Byrd, with his charisma and natural gift for oratory, stood out quickly. He was the kind of figure who could command a room, his voice resonant, his presence impossible to ignore. But the America of the 1940s was not the America of today. The country was on the cusp of transformation, yet old prejudices remained deeply rooted. In many small towns, groups like the one Byrd associated with were seen not as extremist, but as part of the local social fabric. They sponsored events, influenced elections, and positioned themselves as defenders of community values. For an ambitious young man, being connected to them might have seemed like a pathway forward. As the years went on, Byrd's political ambitions grew, and with them came the weight of his earlier choices. He entered public life, first in his home state and eventually on the national stage, where his sharp mind and relentless work ethic earned him respect. But shadows have a way of lingering, and the affiliations of his youth followed him, resurfacing again and again as reminders of a past he would later spend decades trying to distance himself from. What makes Byrd's story compelling is not just that he had these early ties, but how dramatically his life and career evolved afterward. Over time, he became one of the longest-serving senators in American history, a figure who played a central role in shaping policy for generations. In later years, he would publicly acknowledge his past, expressing regret and working to repair the damage of those youthful decisions. His journey illustrates not only the power of ambition but also the capacity for change, however imperfect and complicated that process may be. Looking back, Byrd's early affiliations serve as a mirror of a broader reality, the normalization of organizations that thrived in mid-century America. It was not only Byrd. Across the country, in both local and national politics, there were others who had similar ties. In certain regions, joining such groups was seen less as a radical act and more as a way of securing one's place in the community. That normalization is one of the most sobering reminders of how deeply entrenched these organizations once were, and how their influence reached into unexpected corners of society. By the time Byrd's career entered its later decades, the cultural landscape had shifted dramatically. The civil rights movement had redrawn the nation's moral compass, and the affiliations that once seemed acceptable were now widely condemned. Byrd's evolution, his apologies, his later support for civil rights legislation, and his attempts to atone, reflected not only personal growth but also the sweeping transformation of the nation itself. His story is a reminder that history is rarely simple, and that individuals can embody both the failures of their time and the possibility of redemption. The tale of Robert Byrd is ultimately one of complexity. It is about how a young man, shaped by the environment and norms of his era, made choices that would later haunt him. It is about how ambition can lead people into troubling paths, and how the passage of time can bring both accountability and change. Most importantly, it underscores the fact that the influence of organizations that once thrived in America was not confined to the margins. They touched politics, culture, and society at the highest levels. In remembering Byrd's early ties, we are not only recalling the story of one man but also reflecting on a chapter of American history where dangerous ideas were treated as ordinary. His journey from youthful entanglement to seasoned statesman shows how deeply the nation has struggled with its past, and how even those who reach the pinnacles of power can carry the burden of choices made long ago. It is a reminder that history's shadows stretch far, but they also reveal the paths we must take to move forward. Once, the Klan was a name that carried weight and fear across entire regions of the United States. It was not merely a fringe group, but at times a cultural and political force that could sway elections, influence laws, and create an atmosphere of intimidation for anyone who dared to resist its presence. But history, with its relentless tide, has a way of eroding even the mightiest of movements. The sprawling organization that once counted millions among its ranks has withered over the decades. Today, what remains is no longer a unified empire but a scattering of small, fractured groups, isolated and diminished, clinging to the remnants of an identity rooted in division. These remnants are spread thinly across the country, numbering only in the low thousands. Their influence, compared to the heights of the 1920s or the violence of the 1960s, is but a shadow of the past. They no longer command statehouses or draw massive rallies with tens of thousands in attendance. Instead, they exist mostly in fragmented cells, often quarreling among themselves, unable to maintain the vast networks that once gave them power. And yet, despite their decline, they remain a symbol of something larger, something that continues to challenge the American spirit. Because while the groups themselves are weaker, the ideas they represent have proven far harder to erase. That is why, even now, the Klan is officially recognized as a domestic extremist organization, watched closely by authorities and remembered in the public imagination as a warning. Its name carries the weight of history, serving as a reminder that division and hatred, if left unchecked, can grow into something that scars a nation. In many ways, the modern Klan functions less as a movement and more as a relic, an echo of a bygone age that nevertheless refuses to disappear entirely. Their robes and symbols, once designed to project power and inspire fear, now appear antiquated to many, relics of an ideology that most Americans have rejected. And yet, beneath the surface, the persistence of these groups reminds us that the work of building a just and inclusive society is never truly finished. History does not simply vanish with the passing of time, its shadows linger, urging us to remain vigilant. The decline of the Klan is also a story of resilience. It reflects the countless individuals, communities, and movements who stood up against intimidation and refused to be silenced. From the Reconstruction era through the Civil Rights Movement and into the present day, progress has always been hard-fought. Every gain toward equality, every step toward justice, has come in spite of resistance. And the weakening of the Klan is itself a testament to those victories, a reminder that while hatred may endure, it does not have to prevail. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: organizations may rise and fall, but the deeper struggles they embody continue. The presence of a diminished Klan today is less about the group itself and more about what it represents, America's ongoing challenge to confront prejudice, to learn from its history, and to build a future where fear cannot dictate freedom. So when we look at the Klan now, fragmented and reduced to scattered groups with little real power, we are not simply looking at the story of an organization in decline. We are looking at a mirror of America's journey, its darkest chapters, its struggles, and its capacity to change. The very existence of these remnants reminds us of where we have been, and where we must never go again. History's shadows may still stretch across the present, but they also highlight the progress already made. The once mighty empire of fear is now reduced to fragments, and in that decline lies a powerful truth: movements rooted in division may endure, but they cannot outlast the persistence of those committed to justice, equality, and hope. Thank you for joining this journey into history. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who care about uncovering the truths of the past. Until next time, I wish you peace, reflection, and a very good night.